I remember the way the cold settled in that afternoon, not as a sudden thing, but as a creeping pressure, the kind that worked through the seams of my jacket and took its time settling against my ribs. The sky had been gray all morning, but by late day it had sunk into a dull iron color, flat and featureless, as though the mountains were holding up a lid of weather that just kept dropping lower. Snow had been falling off and on for hours, but around 4 it picked up, thin, needling flakes at first, then heavier ones that came in sideways on the wind. By the time we were glassing the cut-over ridge, the air felt tight, and whatever daylight was left drained out fast. Mark had moved down the slope maybe 10 minutes earlier to check a game trail we'd marked on the map the night before. I could still pick out the block of blaze orange through the trees when he left, a steady, familiar shape moving in and out of the young pines as he dropped. He had the kind of stride that made it easy to track him, even when the forest swallowed everything else. I stayed up on the knob with my pack propped against a stump and the ridge falling away below me. The cutover opened into a long, uneven sweep of timber, islands of lodgepole, pockets of bare ground, scattered blowdowns, and strips of brush. Tracks had been everywhere that morning: elk, deer, a few older wolf prints, but nothing fresh enough to work. By late afternoon, a small group of cows had drifted out of the far timber, grazing in a loose string along the edge of the cut. They moved slow, heads down, snow piling on their backs as though it had been there all day. I kept the glass steady on them, watching for a bull shadowing the fringe. Everything felt quiet in that heavy way that comes with winter storms. Even the wind had a muffled edge, like it had to push itself through the cold before reaching my ears. When the first shot cracked down the draw, it cut straight through that quiet, sharp enough to feel in my teeth. Too far to be Mark. His .308 had a certain snap I knew immediately, but this one carried differently, longer, flatter, echoing up the drainage with a hollow tail. I lifted my head, listening for a second shot, trying to map the angle. 30 seconds later it came. Another distant pop, then a third. They weren't spaced like someone working on an animal. The rhythm was off. Not rushed, but deliberate in a way I couldn't settle with. I pulled my phone from the chest pocket of my jacket and typed the text without thinking. The screen was already fogging from my breath. "You good?" I waited, watching the cows drift deeper into the timber as though the shots meant nothing to them. No reply. I thumbed the radio on and got only static, a scratchy high noise that flickered in and out as I turned along the slope. I figured the storm was messing with the radio, and the ridge often blocked cell coverage, but something about the silence pressed at me. I packed my glass, slung my rifle, and started side-hilling toward the last place I'd seen Mark. The snow had thickened so much the air felt like a curtain I had to push through. My breath rose in slow clouds that hung in front of my face longer than they should have. Every few steps I'd pause and look downslope, trying to pick out his orange again. When I finally spotted it, I stopped so suddenly the snow slid forward under my boots. Only it wasn't one vest. It was two. Both the same bright orange, both the same size and shape at that distance, moving slowly and deliberately through the trees in a line parallel to where Mark had gone. They weren't talking, not even gesturing, just walking the same direction he'd taken, same pace, like they were tracking him without needing to see him. I stood there longer than I should have, trying to make sense of it. We hadn't seen anyone else parked at the trailhead that morning, and the fresh snow all day should have shown new tracks if anyone had come in after us. I kept watching them, trying to convince myself they were hunters who'd come up another route, maybe from a ranch road I didn't know about. But nothing about the way they moved matched the casual rhythm of hunters easing through timber. They were too even, too precise. I didn't want to shout across the draw, but my nerves got ahead of caution. I raised my voice, loud enough to carry but not enough to spook anything. The sound vanished into the storm as though the snow had swallowed it. The two figures stopped at the exact same time. They didn't look at each other first or shift around to find their balance. They just stopped. Then each one turned their head in my direction. Not their bodies, only their heads, and held still. That held moment stretched long enough for the cold to work deeper into my gloves. I tried to track their faces, but the trees and heavy snow smeared everything into partial shapes. Before I could make sense of anything, both figures stepped backward in unison, as if pulled, and slipped behind the trees. No scramble, no hurry. Just gone. My first instinct was to call Mark again on the radio, but the static made my jaw clench. I picked up my pace across the slope, watching the last place I'd seen the strangers and trying to keep my breathing steady. The trees cut me off from open sight lines every few seconds. My tracks filled in almost as soon as I made them, the wind dragging loose snow across the ground. The storm had swallowed the vastness of the drainage and turned it into a tight, close place where sound didn't travel right. It took 20 minutes to reach the small bench where Mark had planned to check the trail. I found him half crouched near his pack, white-faced, hands working fast to get everything cinched down. Snow clung to his beard, the edges of his pack straps, the back of his gloves. Even without words, I could tell something had shaken him hard. His tracks were clear, but around them another set cut in and out. Fresh prints, crisp around the edges, the heel pressure deep. They circled his position twice, crossing themselves, always stopping just short of where he'd set his pack on the ground. They weren't his boots. The tread was different, with a narrow heel and a sharp forward edge. Whoever made them had walked right up to his gear, then backed away, then approached again from another direction. Mark's face said everything. Whatever he'd seen or heard down there, it hadn't been a misunderstanding. We didn't linger. He shoved the last strap into place, slung the pack, and jerked his head uphill. We moved without speaking, rifles in hand but not raised, each of us watching opposite sides as we climbed out of the drainage. The snow deepened as we gained elevation, softening the edges of everything until the whole landscape blurred. Several times I thought I caught shapes in my periphery, flickers of orange, lines of movement between the trees, but every time I turned, the forest was empty. The storm made it impossible to track anything, and the wind carried small scuffs and crunches that mimicked footsteps just far enough away to keep doubt alive. We climbed until the ridge finally leveled, then pushed hard toward the trailhead. The storm had nearly blanked out the sky. Daylight was gone by the time we reached the truck, and my hands shook enough that I missed the door handle twice. We loaded our gear with the same urgency you get when your instincts tell you something is close even when you can't see it. Once we hit the road and dropped to a lower elevation, the storm thinned. Snow still fell, but the world opened again, sound returning in small pieces, the engine hum, the ping of ice on the wheel wells. Only then did the tension ease enough for me to sort through what had happened. Nothing about the day gave us any supernatural impression. There were no impossible shapes, no strange lights, no sounds that couldn't be explained. Everything we saw fit within the bounds of real people moving through real woods. That was what unsettled me most. Someone had been up there with us, close enough to circle Mark's position twice without making a sound he could pin down. Two people had paced his route, matching his direction, staying parallel without announcing themselves. They had worn blaze orange but acted with a deliberate quiet that didn't fit hunters, hikers, or anyone simply sharing the mountain. The boot prints confirmed it. Fresh tracks circling his gear, stopping just where he'd left his pack. Whoever they were, they had been aware of us the entire time. They had watched Mark long enough to trace his path, and when I'd called out, they hadn't made any gesture to identify themselves. They had just looked and stepped back into the trees, as though staying unseen mattered more than anything else. We talked through every practical explanation later. Another hunting party, people scouting winter access, ranch hands running boundary checks, but none of those fit the details. No trucks at the trailhead, no new tire tracks, no voices, no radios, no headlamps on the way out. And the precision of their movements stayed with me, a quiet, calculated presence that felt more like surveillance than chance. We never went back to that drainage. Not because of fear in the dramatic sense, but because the mountains are wide enough that you don't need to share them with people who move like that and leave no sign except for the moments you catch them watching. The forest holds plenty of uncertainties on its own, weather, terrain, wildlife, but the one thing you expect from other people out there is transparency. You expect them to announce themselves, to call out, to wave a hand, to acknowledge the space they're sharing. The two figures on that slope offered none of that. They moved with purpose but without identity, watching in a way that felt intentional. And knowing that someone can be that close in a storm, that silent, that focused, shifted something in me. Not fear, exactly, but a new understanding of the kind of company the mountains sometimes keep. I had been calling coyotes for years, long enough to know that most nights in eastern Colorado amounted to nothing more than cold air, long waits, and the occasional distant bark that never came closer. That February night in 2022 felt no different when we parked on a dirt two-track north of Burlington, stepped out into the kind of cold that makes fabric sound brittle, and walked a few hundred yards into a frozen wheat field. The field stretched wide and flat, the stubble poking through a thin crust of snow, each stalk rimed with ice that sparkled under the stars. The wind came steady out of the north, not gusting, just pushing a constant stream of cold against the exposed skin around my jaw. I remember how quiet the power lines were along the section road, barely humming. Everything felt stripped down and still. I carried the electronic call in one hand, the remote in the other, and walked out about 30 yards from where we planned to lay prone. I set the caller on a small mound of dirt, checked the battery light, and thumbed through the sound list on the remote. I settled on a lone rabbit distress, something soft enough to match how calm the night felt. Nothing about the setup seemed unusual. We'd run the same routine dozens of times. We slid down in the snow at the edge of the field, rifles laid out in front of us, safeties on, breath puffing white. The stubble pressed through my jacket and jabbed at my ribs, but after a minute I barely noticed it. The call started its low, uneven wail. Out on the plains the sound carries farther than you think, and the first few seconds always make me uneasy, like the noise isn't just traveling but searching. I watched the fence line on the far side of the field, a straight dark line with old posts leaning at odd angles. Beyond that was open prairie, just a darker shade of black under the sky. Nothing moved at first, just the dry shimmer of stars overhead and the faint motion of wheat heads clicking in the wind. Maybe 2 minutes in, I picked up the reflection of eyes. One pair, then another, then more. They appeared low along the fence line, spaced out like beads on a wire, drifting in with that cautious glide coyotes have when they're curious but not committed. I guessed 8 or 10, more than I'd seen together in that area. I felt a tightness in my chest, the familiar mix of excitement and calculation. My gloves felt suddenly too bulky, and I shifted my hands to make sure my grip was right. The eyes kept coming, slow and deliberate. We both clicked our safeties off, not raising the rifles yet, just brushing into readiness. The caller kept whining, a soft, rhythmic cry. The wind held steady, giving us good scent control, pushing our smell southward. Everything about the approach felt textbook, almost too clean. I tried to judge which one would break toward the center of the field first. I remember thinking the lead animal was larger than usual, but distance plays tricks under starlight. At 100 yards, the whole group stopped at the exact same moment. Every pair of eyes froze, bright against the dark, catching the starlight and the faint glow from the small town miles behind us. The caller kept playing, but none of them moved another inch. The sudden stillness felt wrong. Coyotes usually shift, reposition, test angles. These didn't. They held low to the ground, a line of small burning points staring straight ahead. My breath grew shallow behind the balaclava. The stubble under my chest suddenly felt sharper, as if the entire field had grown tense. I tried to make sense of their hesitation. Maybe they winded something. Maybe another animal was nearby. But the wind direction made that unlikely, and I saw no movement anywhere else. I steadied my breathing and waited for one to peel off. None did. Then, without any warning, every set of eyes began to rise. Not in a jump or a lunge. They lifted smoothly, too smoothly, drifting upward until they were set too high for coyotes. The movement looked mechanical, not like any animal I had watched in years of hunting. I couldn't see bodies, only the reflections rising above the height of any known predator out there. My mind scrambled for explanations, trying to force the scene into something familiar. Maybe deer stepping out from behind the fence, maybe cattle farther back catching the light at the right angle. But the spacing was wrong, the height was wrong, the motion was far too synchronized. My brain kept rejecting each guess as fast as I formed it. Before I could settle on anything, the caller cut out mid-cry. A half-second of silence followed, sharp enough to feel like pressure in my ears. Then a new sound blasted through the speaker, louder than anything I had set the volume to. It was a man's voice, calling repeatedly, using my name, with the same tone and inflection my father had when he tried to get my attention across a field. But my father wasn't there. He was hours away at home, asleep, unaware we were even hunting that night. I felt a cold wave roll through my body deeper than the February air. I stared at the remote, my thumb far from the buttons. I hadn't touched anything. The remote screen stayed on the rabbit distress line, as if nothing had changed. The voice kept repeating from the caller. The cold air made it feel like the sound was coming from everywhere at once, bouncing off the wheat stubble, carrying all the way to the fence line where the eyes had risen. I tried to tell myself the file list had glitched, that some old recording I forgot about was playing. But the voice was too recent, too specific, and I had never recorded my father. The wind pushed the sound sideways, and the frozen silence of the plains turned it into something hollow and stretched. Neither of us raised a rifle. Neither of us tried to identify what stood at the fence line anymore. Every instinct in my body told me the smartest thing we could do was leave the same way we came. We backed out on our bellies, sliding slowly through the snow, keeping our eyes forward. My gloves soaked through as I pushed myself backward, but I didn't dare stand. The caller kept shouting until the wind smothered the sound as we neared the truck. By the time my hand found the cold metal of the tailgate, my legs were shaking. We climbed into the cab without saying anything, rifles still chambered, and drove out with the headlights bouncing off the ruts. The mirrors stayed dark. The caller's sound faded behind us, swallowed by the night. We didn't talk the entire drive back. The heater barely made a difference, and the cab smelled of cold fabric and metal. I kept replaying the scene in my head, trying to attach names to the shapes I couldn't fully see. I forced myself to think about rational possibilities. Someone else in the field, prank equipment, a hacked caller, reflections from something mounted high along the fence. Anything that kept the night within the bounds of the normal world. By the time we hit pavement again, my throat felt sore from holding my breath for so long. The next morning I brought the caller inside and plugged it into my computer. Every sound file was corrupted. The file names, the data, everything looked shredded and unreadable. All except one. A new file sat at the bottom of the list, time-stamped 11:43 p.m., the moment the caller had shifted. The file name was Turnaround. I stared at it until my eyes went dry. I didn't open it. I deleted the entire drive, reset the device, and boxed it up to send to the manufacturer under warranty. When they emailed weeks later, they said the memory board had suffered a complete failure inconsistent with normal wear. They asked if the device had been exposed to a strong electrical source. I couldn't think of anything. There were no power stations nearby, no storms, no equipment in the field besides what we carried. Since that night I've replayed every detail, trying to assign ordinary causes to what we saw and heard. The only explanation that fits, even partly, is that someone with high-end equipment was out there, night vision rigs, audio gear, maybe drones with infrared lights mimicking eye shine, maybe a signal interceptor capable of forcing a file into the caller's system. The plains are wide open, and a person with resources and a reason could stage something elaborate without being seen. It doesn't explain why they chose that moment or how they got the voice so exact, but it anchors the memory to something human, something physical, something I can at least picture. That's the version I hold on to. Something or someone out there had the tools to manipulate what we saw and heard, to make the familiar feel foreign, to turn a simple night of calling coyotes into a situation we weren't prepared for. The rising shapes at the fence line were likely drones lifting in unison. The voice was likely a spliced recording, pulled from some trace of audio that should never have been accessible. The corrupted files were the result of forced input, not anything supernatural. There's comfort in choosing the explanation that keeps the world solid under my feet. But even with that conclusion, I haven't run another set in that part of the state. Whenever I drive east on I-70 at night and see the faint outlines of those wheat fields, I feel the same weight in my chest. I can still picture the row of eyes rising higher than they should, and I can still feel the frozen stubble digging into my ribs as the caller shouted my name into the dark. I had been on the road long before dawn, driving the frozen two-track by the weak spill of my headlights. The cold in northern New Mexico that December had settled into the kind that bites through layers and stiffens everything, zippers, straps, fingertips. When I stepped out at the little pull-off where I usually parked, the air had the metallic bite of open country winter, sharp enough that each breath felt like it scraped the inside of my nose. I shouldered my pack and rifle, swung my headlamp once across the sage flat to check my bearings, then clicked it off and started walking in the dark. I'd planned the morning the night before, thermos filled, layers laid out, scope cleaned, tripod strapped tight. I liked being in position well before the sun crept over the eastern mesas. The flat I glassed was nothing dramatic, just a broad wash of sagebrush broken here and there by narrow draws and the soft outline of a low ridge that ran north to south. Elk moved through it late in the year, slipping between the pinyon pockets and the open sage, never lingering long, always drifting like smoke. If you weren't looking at the right 15 yards at the right minute, you missed them completely. I reached the shallow rise I used as my glassing point and settled in. The snow there was thin and crusted, the kind that flaked like old paint when pressed. I unfolded the tripod legs slowly so they wouldn't snap or squeal, then locked the spotting scope in place. The light was still a blue-gray wash over everything, but I could already see the long shadows the sage cast across the snow. I swept the flat in slow, overlapping lines, letting my eyes adjust. The cold made everything feel more distant, sound, color, even my own thoughts. I sat still for so long that frost began to form on the tops of my gloves. Time stretched the way it does on hunts when nothing moves, becoming less a series of minutes and more a long, quiet wait with no clear edges. Somewhere behind me, a lone truck droned along a distant highway, then faded. After that, there was nothing but the faint pop of freezing ground and the soft hiss of wind slipping around the ridge. At 8:05, a small flicker of motion caught the corner of my eye. I shifted the scope and locked onto it. 3 shapes were easing along the base of the ridge, blending into the pinyon shadows. Even without antlers, their size gave them away. 3 cows, moving with that steady, unhurried rhythm that elk have when they aren't spooked but aren't relaxed either. Their breath hung in little clouds above their muzzles. They stayed low, following a natural seam in the terrain that hid most of their bodies from the flat below. I felt that surge of focus that comes when everything you've been waiting for finally enters the frame. I packed the scope, folded the tripod, and began angling down the rise. The snow gave that unmistakable squeak under each step, loud enough that I winced every time. It was impossible to move quietly, so I moved steadily, trying to match their pace as I dropped into the shallow draw that paralleled their route. The elk tracks in the snow appeared and disappeared depending on the shadow and the angle of the drift, but I could follow their general direction easily. I kept to the low ground, moving from pinyon to pinyon, checking the ridge above every minute or so. I figured if I stayed patient, I'd cut them off as they wrapped around a bend toward a small bowl on the far end. They liked that bowl. There was still a little feed there, even this late in the season. About 15 minutes into the stalk, I noticed something that made me stop. The elk tracks had grown clearer where the sun hit them, and there were 4 sets instead of 3. I crouched and studied them. The first 3 were the distinct, splayed prints of elk, but the 4th was unmistakably human. A boot tread, maybe size 11 or 12, cut deep into the snow. The edges were crisp. The impressions were fresh. Whoever it was had been following the same group, moving just off to the side of their line, keeping parallel but never overtaking them. I straightened and scanned the ridge, expecting to see someone in blaze orange or a silhouette slipping between trees. But the slope was empty, just pinprick shadows beneath the pinyon branches and the smooth curve of rock jutting from the top. I told myself another hunter had simply gotten ahead of me before sunrise. It wasn't unusual in late-season hunts for people to spread out across the same country. Still, the way the boot prints hugged the elk route bothered me. They weren't random wandering, they tracked with intent. I kept going but slowed my pace, listening for anything besides wind. The crusted snow carried every sound farther than normal, but the country was quiet enough that my breathing sounded too loud. I followed the prints until a sharp clack cracked through the cold air, the distinct metallic sound of a rifle bolt cycling. I dropped instantly, belly pressed into the snow. The shock of the cold punched through my layers. I scanned upward, heart thudding, but the ridge crest was motionless. The sound had come from somewhere above me, but it was impossible to tell how far. It could have been 30 yards. It could have been 100. The silence after it was worse than the sound itself, wide and empty, as if the ridge were listening back. I didn't call out. Without knowing where the person was aiming, raising my voice or standing would have been stupid. Instead, I backed away on my elbows and knees, retracing the line I'd taken down into the draw. My movements were slow and deliberate, pushing through the snow 1 inch at a time. When I felt I was far enough from the ridge, I stood and followed my own tracks out, making sure to keep the slope in view the whole time. Only then did I notice something new. Every place where my tracks crossed the unknown boot prints, the other stride shortened. It was subtle, but clear. The person had adjusted pace each time our paths intersected on the ground. They had been tracking the elk, but they had also been tracking me, watching without coming close, moving whenever I moved. The country suddenly felt twice as large and half as safe. I stayed alert all the way back to the truck, scanning every fold and shadow. I saw no movement, no flash of color, no fresh prints cutting across my route. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined the bolt cycling, but the crisp memory of it stayed sharp in my mind. That sound had been real. When I crested the last rise before the pull-off, my breath caught. My driver's side door was cracked open. Just an inch, maybe 2. Enough for the dome light to glow weakly inside, its yellowish hue smudged by the cold. I knew I had shut the door tight when I left. I'd heard it latch, felt it seal against the weather stripping. The cold wind had no strength to push it open. Something, or someone had touched it. I approached slowly, testing each step. The snow around the truck was churned in places where I had walked earlier, but there were new impressions too. A few boot prints, pressed deep, spaced evenly, coming from the direction of the ridge. They led straight to the truck, paused at the door, then circled around to the passenger side before disappearing back toward the slope. Inside the cab, the air was colder than outside, as if the truck had been opened long enough to drain all warmth. The faint frost on the inside of the windshield had been wiped in one spot, a small arc where someone had drawn with a gloved finger. In the thin film of frost, the words stood out clearly. Good stock. No signature. No smudge of a handprint. No other markings. Just those two words, written with an uneasy kind of neatness, the letters tall and narrow, the way someone writes when they're steady but cold. I stood there for a long time, staring at the message while wind rattled the sage around me. The meaning of it settled slowly. Someone had been behind me all morning, matching my pace, studying my movements the same way I had been studying the elk. They had watched me glass, watched me move down the ridge, heard my steps in the crusted snow. The bolt cycling hadn't been a mistake. It had been a signal, a way of letting me know they were there without showing themselves. I brushed the words from the windshield, started the truck, and let the heater run until my hands stopped shaking. The country outside the windows looked the same as it had an hour earlier. Quiet, open, undisturbed, but I no longer felt alone in it. Even as I drove away, following the frozen two-track back toward the highway, I kept checking the mirror, half expecting a figure to step out onto the road behind me. Nothing did. The ridge stayed still, holding whatever it held. And the only sign that the morning had been anything other than an ordinary hunt was the faint streak on the windshield where those letters had been, a thin smear in the frost that wouldn't quite fade until the cab finally warmed. I didn't go back to that flat the rest of the season. I kept hunting, but I chose different places, spots where the country felt open enough that I could see anyone approaching long before they got close. I told myself I was being cautious, not spooked. But each time I thought about that neat, cold handwriting on the glass, I knew the truth. Someone had tracked me better than I had tracked the elk, and they had wanted me to know it. I got the call about the deer tags in early November, the same envelope that showed up every year, only this time my uncle's name wasn't printed beside mine. I set it on the kitchen counter for almost a week before I opened it. The season wasn't going to wait, and part of me felt like skipping it altogether, but it didn't seem right. He had taken me to that camp since I was 12. He'd shown me how to read the land, how to listen, how to walk slow enough that I could hear my own thinking. Going felt like the only way to keep something steady in a year that hadn't offered much steadiness at all. I drove down to the Mark Twain National Forest the night before opening weekend, taking the same cracked two-lane roads I could follow on autopilot. The last few miles were gravel, the kind that throws dust so thick it looks like fog in the taillights. By the time I reached the turnoff for the camp, it was already full dark, and the forest around the headlights looked flat and colorless, like it was refusing to show any depth until I proved I belonged there. The cabin sat exactly where it always had, crouched between two big oaks with bark thick as armor. The porch light didn't work anymore, so the front was just a block of shadow. I parked beside the split firewood pile, grabbed my duffel, and let myself in. The clock on the wall blinked 10:15. The air inside held that old mix of dry timber, dust, and gasoline from the lantern fuel stored under the sink. It felt familiar, but in a way that made my chest tighten. I put my gear on the bottom bunk, the one I'd always used, and stepped back out onto the porch for a moment to breathe the night air. The woods were cold, the kind of sharp cold that makes every sound more noticeable. Leaves rustled somewhere off to the left, probably deer moving through the underbrush. An owl gave one short call, then nothing. The quiet after that call seemed too deep, like the forest had pulled a blanket over its own head. I stood there until my fingers started to sting, then went inside, switched off the lantern, and crawled into the bunk fully dressed. I'd meant to get up at 5, but when I opened my eyes, the window was already faintly bright. My phone said 6:42. I cursed under my breath, shoved my boots on without bothering to warm them, and grabbed my pack. The air bit at my ears as soon as I stepped outside. Frost covered the leaves in a thin white crust. I didn't bother with coffee. I just started walking the old logging road toward the stand. The first thing I noticed was the track. A single boot print at the edge of the path, dark against the frost. I stopped and stared at it, trying to remember if I might have stepped there a moment earlier without paying attention. But as I walked forward, more appeared. A clean row of them, heading the same direction I was headed. The frost was thin and powdery, the sort that melts under any weight. These prints looked new, made barely an hour earlier. I knelt and put my fingers into the closest one. The frost had melted into a shallow pool of water inside the tread pattern. Whoever made it had passed through after sunrise. I looked back at the cabin through the trees, expecting to see something, movement, light, anything, but the place stayed dark and still. I kept walking, scanning the prints. The stride was what made my stomach twist. Long, even steps that seemed too spaced out for anyone but my uncle. He had that tall, loose way of walking, like he was never in a hurry. I could picture him on this same trail, the cuffs of his jeans brushing frost off the ferns. It didn't make sense for anyone else to walk exactly like that, heel to heel, matching the same rhythm I'd grown up watching. About 100 yards from the split in the old logging road, the tracks drifted toward the right, leaving the path and cutting into the maples. I slowed down, listening for any sound. The woods were still. I followed the prints, stepping over a fallen limb and ducking under a low branch. The trail of melted frost continued for a few yards before the ground shifted into leaf litter that held no shape. The ladder stand stood ahead of me between two maples, its metal frame dark with cold. I didn't notice the hat right away. I saw only the tree, the shadowed base, the dark rectangle where the stand's platform sat 10 feet up. Then I saw color. A faded orange spot hanging from a branch shoulder high. It was my uncle's hat. The same old mesh back cap with the sweat-stained bill and the faded farm equipment logo on the front. I recognized every mark on it. We had buried him wearing it, or at least I thought we had. I remembered the funeral home, the open casket, the way the hat had looked strangely clean compared to the rest of him. Now here it hung, damp from frost, the bill slightly bent the way he always shaped it with his hands. For a few seconds I didn't move. The woods around me seemed to hold their breath. I reached out slowly and touched the rim of the hat. It was cold and pliable, like it had been outside all night. There was no tag of new stitching, no sign it was a replica or replacement. It was the same one. That heavy, impossible fact sat in my chest like a stone. I looked around the clearing, half expecting to find someone else there, maybe another hunter playing some deeply unfunny joke. But the forest didn't hold any footprints beyond the few I'd followed. No broken branches, no cigarette smell, no sign of anyone camping nearby. I took the hat and folded it into my pack, telling myself I'd figure out the explanation later. Hunting didn't feel right after that. I climbed the stand and sat there for an hour, but every creak of the metal ladder made me tense, and every crack of a twig sounded like a boot step. Eventually I climbed down, walked back to the cabin, and started packing my things. I wasn't scared exactly. It was something else. A feeling like I'd been let in on the wrong side of a truth I didn't want to know. Inside the cabin, I checked the small storage shed and the firewood stack. Nothing disturbed. I made sure the lantern fuel was capped, the windows latched, the stove cool. Before leaving, I unscrewed the porch light bulb out of habit, the way my uncle had taught me to do when we didn't want insects swarming the place while it sat empty. I locked the front door with the old brass key and started the truck. The gravel road behind me stretched through the trees like a pale ribbon. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting only darkness where the cabin rested. The porch light blinked twice, a quick double flicker, then went out. I slammed the brakes and stared. I knew the bulb wasn't in the socket. I had unscrewed it myself. I walked back through the memories in my head, making sure I hadn't imagined that small twist of the glass. But I knew I hadn't. Something else explained the light. A short in the wiring, maybe, or some residual charge in the line. The cabin was old, older than both of us combined. It wasn't unusual for the electrical system to misbehave. My uncle had rewired the place himself decades earlier, using parts salvaged from a barn. He used to complain about phantom voltage in the lines, how the cabin sometimes flickered even when everything was switched off. The more I thought about it, the more every strange detail bent toward an explanation rooted in him, not in anything unearthly. He'd kept duplicates of his gear everywhere, including extra hats. I'd seen him buy 3 of the same style once after a sale. For all I knew, one of those extras had been left at the cabin years ago, wedged behind a beam or in a drawer until a raccoon or storm wind knocked it loose. As for the boot prints, they could have belonged to any tall hunter passing through before dawn. The stride looked familiar because I was looking for familiarity. A mind under strain connects dots, even when the lines are crooked. And the light, faulty wiring, nothing more. I sat there in the truck a moment longer, breathing the cold air from the vents. The explanations weren't perfect, but they were enough. Enough to make sense of things without turning them into something they weren't. Grief rearranges the world in strange ways. Sometimes it makes coincidences feel weighted, as if the person you lost is still trying to walk the same paths you do. When I finally drove off, the cabin stayed dark behind me. The road curved out of sight, and the forest returned to its usual shape. The hat rode in my pack on the passenger seat, smelling faintly of old sweat and pine. I didn't feel unsettled anymore, just tired in a deep, honest way. Whatever had happened that morning, it was grounded in real things: footprints, frost, old wiring, forgotten gear, and in the way memory threads itself into the land. By the time I reached the highway, the sun had lifted over the tree line, burning off the last of the frost. The world looked ordinary again, steady and bright. I kept driving, letting the miles smooth the edges of the morning, knowing I'd return next season. Some places feel woven into you, even when the person who tied those knots is gone. I was bow hunting whitetails behind my in-laws' place in rural Ohio on November 10th, 2019, the kind of cold, gray afternoon that usually settles into something good around sunset. The patch of woods behind their house wasn't big, maybe 30 acres at most, but it had enough cover to hold deer when the surrounding cornfields were bare. I had a small hang-on stand already set up along a worn trail, tucked between an oak and a hickory that tangled their branches overhead like a roof. I climbed up around 3 in the afternoon, buckled my harness in, and let myself sink into the way the woods feel when they're hours from dark and nothing's moving except the wind. For the first hour, nothing unusual happened. Squirrels worked across the leaves like they always do, sounding too heavy for their size. Now and then a crow drifted over the fields and settled in the treeline, wings thumping as it landed. A light breeze pushed the smell of cold dirt and the faint sweetness of whatever corn the combine had missed. I knew the deer would move late, so I kept still, legs dangling, bow hanging from a hook, breath quiet against my neck gaiter. The whole world felt small and predictable, the way woods usually do when you've hunted them long enough. Around 4:20, I heard gravel crunch out on the old lane that ran between the fields. It was the familiar sound of tires rolling slow, the kind of noise that carries far on cold air. I figured it was my father-in-law coming home from work. The engine shut off, then a door creaked and slammed. I expected to see the porch light come on, or the back door open, but the house stayed still. No movement, no sound of boots on the deck. Instead, the footsteps came straight into the woods, steady and deliberate, heading toward the area where I was set up. I leaned forward slightly and peered through a screen of oak leaves that still clung stubbornly to their branches. I couldn't make out much beyond shifting shadows, just a dark shape weaving between the trunks. The person wasn't wearing blaze orange, and as far as I could tell, there was no flashlight. Even when hunters forget their vest, they usually carry something that makes light, especially near dusk, but this figure had nothing. They stopped about 20 yards off, far enough that I couldn't get a clear look, but close enough that I could pick up small sounds. A boot brushing leaves, a breath, the subtle crunch of bark under a gloved hand. Then came a different sound, sharp, rhythmic, metallic. It took me a second to place it. It was metal biting into wood, slow and steady, like someone driving something into a tree one measured hit at a time. The spacing was deliberate, almost patient, as if whoever it was didn't want to announce themselves but didn't care if the noise carried. I felt an uneasy pressure in my chest. My stand was on the same tree I hung my climbing sticks on, and the sound was close enough that I could feel the vibrations travel faintly through the trunk. I kept still, hoping the person would say something or step into the open where I could identify them, but they didn't. They just worked the tool, hammer or something like it, against the bark. A moment later, my climbing sticks shifted under my boots. It was slight at first, just a small wobble, but enough to pull my stomach tight. I kept my hands on the seat edges to balance myself, thinking maybe the wind had kicked up, but there was no wind. The stand didn't move, only the sticks below me. The ratchet straps creaked softly. Then the bottom stick slid away from the tree an inch. Then another, like the entire set was being tugged outward. My heart thudded against my ribs. The only thought in my head was that if whoever was below pulled hard enough, the sticks might pivot or break free, and I'd drop straight down through the branches. I didn't know if the person was messing around or trying to do something worse, but I needed them to stop. I whispered a quick warning, not loud, just enough that anyone directly beneath me would hear. The movement stopped immediately. The climbing stick settled back against the trunk with a faint tap, and for a second the woods felt too quiet, as if every sound had been paused. Then I heard the footsteps again, moving away at a steady, unhurried pace. No running, no scrambling. Just a calm retreat through the leaf litter, headed back in the direction of the lane. I sat in the stand without moving until the shape had slipped out of sight. Even then, I stayed still longer, listening for any sign they might be circling back. The sky kept dimming, turning from pale silver to a dull blue that seeped between the branches. I knew I needed to climb down eventually, but my nerves were too tight to rush anything. I made myself wait until the woods shifted into that muted moment right before full dark, when the last birds settle and the air feels colder against your cheeks. When I finally climbed down, I tested each stick carefully, keeping most of my weight against the tree. The straps held, and the stick stayed in place, though the bottom one felt slightly looser than I remembered. My boots touched the ground, and the quiet was thick enough to press at my ears. I turned on my headlamp and swept it around. The beam caught the tree next to mine, the one I'd leaned against earlier in the season while clearing a shooting lane. At first, nothing looked unusual. Then the light hit a line of fresh screw-in steps, angled upward in a crooked climb that stopped just short of where my stand platform sat. The lowest step was at head height, sunk deep and still flecked with bright silver where bark had scraped off. Above it, the bark was scuffed in a rough patch about the size of a fist. The marks were sharp and clean, not weathered, the kind that come from something metal punching in and out again with force. The angle of those scuffs lined up almost exactly with the spot where my spine had been resting against my own tree while I waited in the stand. I walked around the trunk, checking the ground for footprints. The leaves were disturbed in a narrow channel that led back toward the lane, heel marks pressed deep enough to show direction. Whoever had been there had walked with purpose, straight in and straight out, leaving no sign of hesitation. I looked back at the screw-in steps. They weren't placed like someone installing a stand or prepping a tree for a proper setup. They were too close to my tree, too awkwardly angled, too high to start comfortably. They looked more like someone had tried to climb quickly, then changed their mind, or like someone had wanted to get level with my stand, and then strike something into the bark right where I'd been sitting. The scuff marks were too deliberate to ignore. As I stood there, the cold settled deeper into my jacket, and the sky slipped fully into darkness. The lane beyond the woods was silent. No engine started, no door closed. Whoever had come into the trees had either walked in from somewhere else, or was still nearby without making a sound. I didn't like either option. I took down the bottom climbing stick to haul it out with me, more for my own peace of mind than anything, and made my way back through the woods toward the house. Every step felt louder than it should have. The fields on either side looked empty, but I kept checking them, half expecting to see a silhouette standing at the edge, watching. When I reached the yard, the porch light finally clicked on. My father-in-law wasn't home. No vehicle sat in the drive. The house was quiet and dark, like it had been the whole afternoon. The lane showed no fresh tracks that I could see under the weak security light. The next day, I went back out in daylight to look again. The steps were still there. The scuffs were still fresh. The ground showed the same narrow line of footprints. Nothing had changed, and nothing looked like a misunderstanding. No tools left behind, no sign of a stand or camera or anything that might explain why someone would walk into those woods and start climbing the tree next to mine. I removed the rest of the climbing sticks, smoothed the bark with my glove, and stood there long enough to feel the stillness settle back into the trees. The place looked normal again, the way it always had, but the memory of the shifting sticks and those slow, methodical footsteps never softened. Even now, when I think about that evening, the part that sticks with me isn't the noise or the footprints. It's the way the person walked away, unhurried, calm, as if they had done exactly what they came to do and didn't feel any need to hide it. I was blacktail hunting on Vancouver Island in October 2021, just north of Campbell River, the kind of late afternoon where the light thins out fast and the temperature drops even before the sun reaches the trees. It must have been around 4:45 p.m., that dead quiet stretch before sunset when every sound seems to carry farther than it should. I moved along an old skid road, taking slow, even steps, glassing the slash piles on either side, letting the place settle back down after each movement. The only things I heard were the soft scrape of my boots on the dirt and the dry snap of a few alder leaves shifting in a breeze too faint to feel. The air smelled like wet cedar and old mud. The slash piles still held pockets of shadow that looked like they could hide anything, but nothing moved in them. It was the kind of silence that usually means deer are close. I remember being focused enough that time felt stretched thin, the way it does when you've been out all day and your senses sharpen without you noticing. Nothing happened for a long stretch, maybe 20 minutes of nothing, just the rhythm of step, pause, look, listen. Then I heard a sound that made my whole body stiffen. A deer bleat, but not the usual quick alarm call or sharp blow. This was long and uneven, like it came from an animal that didn't have enough air in its lungs. The kind of noise that doesn't fit with anything healthy. It carried through the timber at an angle off the road, somewhere downslope. Instinct took over before thought. I moved toward it, trying to place each step carefully between roots and moss, letting the noise guide me. The forest under the canopy felt different than it had on the road. The light was dimmer and had that green tint that makes everything look damp and older than it is. As I picked through windfall, I noticed the usual signs of deer traffic, but they looked scattered, confused, as if the tracks had been made by animals moving fast without watching where they were going. The bleat came again, thinner this time, and I angled toward it. I found the first sign without expecting it. A tuft of hair, coarse brown-black clumps snagged on a jagged cedar stump where something had forced its way across. It looked fresh, stuck there with still curled ends, the kind that haven't sun-bleached or crumbled yet. I crouched and reached out without touching it, just looking at it and trying to make sense of why it was there alone. A few steps farther on, something bright caught the corner of my eye. A hoof. Just the hoof, clean at the joint, sitting in the moss as if someone had placed it carefully. No blood around it, no drag marks, nothing disturbed. Just that perfect small half-moon shape of a blacktail's hoof, separated from everything it should have been attached to. I should have turned around right then. The thought came to me clearly, the way a sane idea sometimes punches through adrenaline. But the bleeding started again, weaker than before, like something calling from farther away or deeper. It had an odd muffled quality to it now. Curiosity and a hunter's instinct kept me moving, even though my pulse had picked up and every part of the forest suddenly felt too quiet. I kept going, weaving through a section where the ground was soft and the trees grew in close clusters. The sound pulled me toward a slight depression in the earth, a place where the forest floor sagged like an old sponge. It wasn't a hole exactly, more like the ground had settled unevenly between thick roots. The smell there was different, wet soil, fresh-turned earth, and something faint and organic that made the back of my throat tighten. The bleat rose up from directly under my boots. Not beside me, not ahead. Under. The realization dropped into my stomach like a stone. I stepped back instinctively, then leaned forward, staring at the spot. The moss was flattened, the dirt darker than the soil around it. I crouched and brushed my glove across the top layer. The soil shifted too easily, giving way like it had been placed, not packed. There were marks in it. Indentations shaped like fingers, human fingers, dragging through and pulling the earth into place. My hands started shaking even before I moved my rifle. Without really thinking about it, I used the barrel to probe the soft patch. The metal sank in faster than it should have. I felt it slide through loose soil, and then hit something soft but firm and wet, like pushing into a soaked sponge. The moment the barrel touched whatever it was, the bleat stopped. Not faded. Stopped. Cut off clean. I jerked the rifle back and stumbled a step away, staring at the disturbed soil. Whatever was under there, whatever had been making that sound, it wasn't alive anymore. Or it wasn't able to make noise. The silence that followed felt too heavy, as if the whole forest were waiting for something. It didn't feel like being watched, not exactly, but it felt like being considered, like the woods had narrowed around me. The dirt on the barrel smeared dark brown, almost black. I wiped it on my pant leg out of reflex, even though I didn't want to think about what it might contain. The edges of the depression looked freshly worked, the roots pushed aside by hands, not animals. I backed away, slow at first, then faster. On the way out, I regained the skid road and tried to settle back into a steady pace, but my heartbeat refused to slow. The air felt colder, and even the colors around me seemed faded. About 50 yards along the road, something new caught my eye on a tree trunk. A strip of hide, narrow and long, nailed neatly at eye level. I thought it was bark at first, until I saw the soft inner side, pale and almost smooth. It was deer hide. I moved past it quickly and saw another one nailed to the next tree. Same width, same height. The pattern held every 50 yards or so. each one placed precisely, not rough or hurried. I kept walking, not looking too closely, but counting without meaning to. 5 strips. 6. 8. All at the height of my line of sight. Not low, where a hunter might tack something for orientation. Not high, where a marker might be seen from afar. Exactly where I would see them if someone wanted to make sure I noticed. Each one looked freshly cut, still giving off that faint animal smell, the kind you catch when you're field dressing and the wind shifts the wrong way. By the time I reached the end of the skid road where my truck was parked, my hands had finally stopped shaking, but my arms felt hollow. The light had gone that color where everything looks flat and cold, the last minutes before full dusk. I set my rifle in the truck bed and stood there, breathing through the metallic taste in my mouth. I told myself to focus on facts, the way I would if I had come across a poaching site or a deadhead. Something had killed a deer. Someone had dug a hole. Someone had left markers. These were things that people, not animals, did. The more I replayed it, the more the details formed a shape I didn't want to acknowledge but couldn't avoid. The deer hadn't been dragged or cut apart in a messy way. The hoof had been set down. The soil had been smoothed by hand. The strips of hide were spaced with deliberate precision, as if marking a boundary or sending a signal. Whatever was under that depression hadn't been buried long. The sound I heard wasn't natural. It wasn't even possible unless something alive had been put under there. I didn't report anything that night. I drove straight home with the windows cracked, trying to let the cold air keep me steady. But the truth settled in later, long after dark, when I replayed the feel of the rifle barrel hitting that soft shape beneath the earth. That bleat wasn't an animal clinging to life. It was an animal someone had put there deliberately alive, for reasons I don't want to imagine. The next morning I called it in. I told them exactly where to go, what they would find, and what I had heard. I didn't embellish anything. I didn't downplay it either. They asked if I had seen anyone. I hadn't. The strip markers were still there when they went to check, but the soil where I had probed had been reworked again, smoothed over even more cleanly, as if someone returned later that night to tidy the ground. Nothing else was found. No tracks, no tools, no signs of camp or vehicle. Just the hide strips and the disturbed earth. I haven't hunted that area again. Not because of superstition, and not because I'm afraid of the woods. I've been in deep timber my whole life. I know the difference between natural and unnatural, and nothing about what I found that day fit into the world I understood. It was deliberate. Someone was using that forest for something they didn't want anyone else to see. And for reasons I still can't explain, they wanted me to find just enough of it to know that. The snow had started before sunrise, thin grains that ticked against the hood of my jacket as I hiked in. But by the 3rd day of elk season, I was used to cold mornings. What unsettled me more was the wind. It shoved at me in long, steady pushes, the kind that made spruce tops groan and sent loose flakes skittering sideways. I kept my layers zipped up to my throat, but the cold still found seams, sliding down my neck and creeping under my shirt like a poured liquid. It felt too early in the season for weather like that, but Wyoming never asked permission before throwing a front across the mountains. I reached the ridge at 6:02 a.m. I remember the time because I checked my watch just before I raised my bugle tube. The valley below me was still blue with half-light, and the spruce stands looked like hunched shapes tucked tight together. I blew a long, rising call, watching the breath peel off in a white sheet. It barely faded before something in the timber answered, loud and sharp and full of heat. The sound punched straight up the slope and echoed around the bowls and drainages like the whole mountain was reacting. It was the kind of response that cancels out tired legs and numbed fingers. I felt that rush spread through me and started moving toward it without thinking. The next hour blurred into the sort of focused chase that only happens when an elk sounds fired up enough to forget its own caution. I picked my way through dark timber, stepping over deadfall and old elk beds crusted with ice. Every few minutes I bugled again, then waited, breath held, for the answer. It always came. Sometimes it seemed 50 yards off, sometimes farther, but always close enough to keep me convinced I could cut the distance if I moved quickly and kept the wind right. What didn't make sense, though I ignored it at the time, was how the sound kept shifting angles. 1 minute it seemed below me, the next above, then off to my right. Echoes can play tricks, especially in the timber, and I chalked it up to the way the drainage forked in several directions. Snow thickened as the morning wore on. It started sticking to my bow limbs and the bill of my cap, soft clumps that gathered faster than I could brush away. Visibility dropped, the trees around me fading to gray silhouettes. I angled uphill, trying to get above whatever was making the noise, telling myself a little elevation would give me a solid setup. The bull sounded close, too close sometimes, so close I felt it in my ribs, but I never caught movement. Just calls. Sharp, insistent, each one followed by the eerie silence of snowfall muting everything else. I found the meadow by accident, stepping through a ragged stand of young spruce, and seeing the dim opening spread out below. It wasn't a true meadow, just a flattened patch of grass and scattered brush, maybe 20 yards across, half ringed by tall timber. A good place for an elk to step out if it was coming in hard to investigate. I backed up into the trees, settled behind a spruce with thick branches, and nocked an arrow. My breath felt too loud in my ears. The snow hissed on the hood of my jacket. I raised my bugle to call again, but stopped myself. It felt wrong, too aggressive, too much risk of pushing whatever was out there. So I switched to a soft cow call instead, just one short mew, barely more than a breath. The answer came instantly, but it didn't make sense. It wasn't an elk. It was the exact sound I had just made. Same length, same pitch, same unsteady note at the end. It sounded like it came from 20 yards off, maybe less, but the snow blurred everything so badly I couldn't see that far. I froze, bow half drawn, listening hard for anything else. My heartbeat thudded in the same rhythm as the falling snow. I waited, telling myself it was coincidence, that an elk might mimic tone a bit if it was nervous or young or just keyed up. But I'd hunted long enough to know that bull elk do not perfectly copy cow calls. Not like that. I swallowed, tried to steady my breathing, and did nothing for a long few seconds. The quiet deepened in a way that made my shoulders tense. I could smell the resin from the spruce, sharp and clean, mixing with the cold metal scent of snow. Then it came again. Not the cow call this time, but my bugle. The exact cadence I'd blown at dawn, only flattened somehow, like someone trying to remember how it went, and not quite getting the pressure right. The sound rolled through the trees in a way that made every hair on my neck stand up. I knew immediately it wasn't an elk. I knew it the way you know when somebody is walking behind you, even before you hear steps. I stayed crouched, bow drawn, scanning the trees. That's when the footsteps started. Heavy ones, deliberate ones, circling through the timber just beyond sight. The snow made everything harder to judge. Branches sagged, dumped clumps when shaken. I heard one fall off to my left, then something brushed through the needles as if pushing them aside. A few seconds later, another sound behind me. 2 steps, a pause, then a low thump like someone shifting weight. I turned slowly, trying not to snap branches with my boots. My arms burned from holding the bough drawn so long. The footsteps kept moving, always just far enough away that the trunks blocked my view, never close enough for me to see who or what was making them. I kept looking for the tan hide of an elk or the quick movement of a cow slipping through cover, but I saw nothing but drifting snow and tree trunks lined in wet black. It circled again. Each time it moved, the pattern was the same, 3 or 4 steps, a shift, then silence, like it was watching for my reaction. I tried to call out, thinking maybe it was another hunter who had slipped in behind me and was trying to get my attention, but my throat locked up. All I could think about was how closely the calls had matched mine. Not similar, matched. I lowered my bow a little, not enough to unready it, but enough to ease the shaking in my shoulder. My breath steamed out in ragged bursts. I listened for anything that sounded like human movement, a voice, a cough, even the clack of a rifle sling, but none came. Just those slow, deliberate footsteps and the scrape of something brushing bark. The wind kicked up, blowing snow into my face, and for a few seconds everything blurred. When it eased, the footsteps stopped completely. The silence felt thick enough to step on. I strained to hear even a hint of movement. That was when the sound came, soft, almost delicate. Nylon brushing against tree bark. A jacket sleeve, maybe. And then a single low laugh. Not loud, not forced. Just one quiet exhale of sound, right from the spot where I had stood when I bugled at first light. I didn't think. I bolted uphill, arrow still on the string, slipping in the fresh snow and grabbing at branches for balance. My legs shook, both from fatigue and from the cold that had knifed deeper now that adrenaline was fading. I didn't stop until I reached the ridge, chest heaving, sweat cold against my back. I listened hard, but nothing followed. No steps, no calls, no breathing. Only the wind and the steady whisper of falling snow. I made it back to the truck by late morning, soaked through and shivering. Once inside with the heater going, I sat for a long time trying to piece together what had happened. The explanation came slowly, but it came. There had to have been another hunter in the timber, someone who'd slipped in at dawn, maybe tracking the same bull or just scouting in silence. In the storm and the echoes, I must have mistaken their calls for an elk's. Maybe they were trying to mess with me, or maybe they thought I was messing with them, both of us trying to read each other's signals and getting it wrong. The circling, the deliberate steps, the imitated calls, they all fit if I imagined someone cautious, maybe irritated, maybe curious, trying to figure out who they were sharing the mountain with. The laugh bothered me the most, but even that had an answer. Plenty of hunters use nervous humor when they realize how close they've been to someone else without knowing. A low chuckle at the absurdity of it. The nylon on bark was just someone brushing past a trunk on their way out of the setup. Whoever it was must have backed off once they realized I was spooked, or once they understood I wasn't a threat. By the time I drove back toward Pinedale, the storm had eased. The world outside the windshield looked softer, snow clinging to sagebrush and fence lines. No sign left of what had happened in the timber. And the more I thought about it, the more the explanation settled into place. It didn't make the moment any less unnerving, but it made it real. Not a creature or anything impossible, just another person in the wrong place at the wrong time, copying the sounds they heard, waiting for a response, and leaving when things got too strange. I never saw them, and maybe that was the part that kept the memory sharp, but nothing about it was supernatural. It was only the cold, the storm, the echoes, and two hunters chasing the same idea through thick timber on a rough October morning. I had hunted that stretch of flooded timber off the White River for years, long enough to know how the bottoms could feel different from one morning to the next. Sometimes the place seemed wide open, full of sharp sound and crisp air. Other times, especially in early January when the humidity hung low and the cold pressed down, the woods felt too close, the way an old barn leans in on itself. On that morning, right at legal shooting time, it felt like the world had shrunk to a gray cocoon around my buddy and me. The fog was the thickest I had ever seen there. It swallowed the treeline and softened the ripples around the decoys until it looked like everything was half there, as if the cypress trunks and worn boards of the blind were sinking into a dream. We had set up the spread in a pocket where the water drifted just deep enough to slow our steps, but not deep enough to hide the old stumps that rose like wet knuckles from the bottom. I remember checking my watch for the time, 6:24 a.m., and thinking how quiet it all seemed. Ducks should have been moving. On cold mornings they usually flew early, cutting low over the timber before the sun had a chance to reach into the flooded pockets. But we heard only the small ticking sounds of water dripping from the cypress knees and the slow breath of the river beyond the trees. I couldn't see my buddy clearly, even though he was less than 10 feet away on the other end of the blind. Only the shape of him showed through the fog, a darker patch in a wall of gray. When he shifted his weight, the boards creaked under us. That small sound felt too loud, like it didn't belong in the muffled air. I kept scanning the decoys, waiting for the usual flickers of movement or the sudden shadow of wings dropping in from above. The first sign of activity came as a faint rush of air, the unmistakable whistle of wings cutting overhead. It passed right over us, close enough that my skin tightened with the instinct to raise the shotgun. I couldn't see the birds, only heard them veer off and circle somewhere just out of sight. Then there was the splash, one clean break of water, just beyond the outermost decoy. I should have been able to see a shape on the surface, but the fog clung to everything. It felt like trying to look through wet cotton. I lifted my gun and rested my finger on the safety, waiting for the silhouettes of ducks to materialize. Nothing came. Instead, I heard a sound from somewhere off to my left. It wasn't loud, not like a shout or even a clear call. It was soft, strained, almost carried by the fog more than spoken through it. The tone, even without words, made something in my chest tighten. I lowered my shotgun a little and tried to make sense of where it came from. I looked toward the dark smear that I thought was the bank, but there was nothing to see. I listened harder, holding my breath, and for a long moment the only thing I heard was the faint lap of water against the decoys. Then the sound came again, but closer and off to my right this time. It had the jagged texture of someone trying to form words while fighting for breath. I froze without meaning to. The clarity of the struggle in that sound cut through every hunting instinct I had. I felt my body shift on its own, legs bracing in the mud at the bottom of the blind. I stepped out and started pushing through the water toward where the voice had come from. My waders scraped across submerged branches, tugging at my legs. I kept moving anyway, convinced that someone had slipped, maybe from a small boat or a John boat tucked into the timber. The river played tricks on new hunters, and fog like that hid the worst of the snags and deep holes. Behind me, my buddy caught my arm. I could feel the tension in his grip even through the thick sleeve of my jacket. He didn't need to say anything. I already knew the risk in stepping away from the blind in that kind of visibility. The bottom dropped out without warning in some pockets, and the mud around the cypress roots could pull a person under before he had time to react. I stopped, breathing hard, trying to decide whether to keep going or stay put. The sounds around us felt stretched thin, as if the fog itself had taken hold of them. Then a fit of coughing broke out somewhere ahead of us. It was sharp at first, then turned ragged and wet, the kind of sound that made my stomach clench, because it carried the unmistakable weight of someone drowning from the inside. I stood there and listened to it go on. 30 seconds, maybe more. When it trailed off, the silence felt heavier than before. I didn't hear movement or splashing or even breath. Only the slow drip from the branches overhead. For the next hour, we stayed in the blind. The sun didn't rise in any dramatic way. It just thinned the fog little by little until the trees began to take shape again. First the closer cypress trunks, then the ones farther out, their bark slick and dark from the night's moisture. The surface of the water brightened to a dull gray, and the decoys became clear enough that I could see the faint shine of their plastic backs. The quiet didn't lift with the fog. If anything, it grew heavier. Neither of us said anything. We just waited for the moment when everything was visible enough to search the area. When we finally climbed out of the blind and walked toward the spot where we thought the coughing had come from, I kept expecting to see something obvious. A boat turned sideways against a stump, a set of footprints in the mud, a jacket snagged on a low branch. But the bank was untouched. The mud showed nothing but the small marks of water beetles and the soft indentations where fallen twigs had lain overnight. We worked our way along the edge of the timber, scanning the water for any sign of gear or debris. The river beyond the trees moved in its steady, slow current, carrying leaves and bits of driftwood downstream. Nothing else floated in the flooded pocket except our decoys. We checked the trees around the pocket too, walking slowly in case someone had climbed onto a log or pulled himself partway out of the water. The woods smelled of wet bark and cold earth, the way they always did in early winter. The air felt normal again, free of the strange pressure from earlier. But everything looked undisturbed in a way that put a deeper chill in me than the fog had. When we returned to the spread, one of the hen decoys floated slightly tilted, not enough to seem damaged at first glance, but enough to catch my attention. I picked it up and turned it over. The soft plastic along the breast had a clear handprint pressed into it. Not a smudge, not a vague distortion. The shape of fingers and the base of a palm, squeezed in as if someone had grabbed it hard while struggling to stay above water. The print wasn't old either. The edges were sharp, the indentation fresh. I held it for a long moment, feeling the weight of it settle into my chest. There was no reason for anyone to be out there without a boat. The timber was too deep to wade across safely, especially before daylight. Anyone hunting that stretch would have had a dog or a partner, or at least left signs on the bank. But we found nothing, and the handprint on the decoy was the only evidence that someone had been close enough to reach for it. As I looked out across the water, the surface already smoothing from our search, I realized I had heard something that morning that wasn't imagined or carried by wind. Someone had been there, in the fog, struggling for breath and reaching for anything that might hold them up. I still return to that spot each season, but I don't see flooded timber the same way anymore. When the fog rolls in thick and early, I find myself listening past the usual sounds of ducks and river water, waiting for anything out of place. Some mornings I catch myself watching the decoys more than the sky, not for birds dropping in, but for the smallest shift or ripple that might mean someone else is fighting to stay afloat just beyond sight. The memory of that morning stays with me, not because of what I saw, but because of what I didn't, and the certainty that someone was there all the same, unseen but close enough to leave their grip in the soft plastic before the river pulled them away.